Mark was working in the garden when his daughter Sophie came running. "Daddy! Daddy!" she yelled, running to the garden. She came running with a bag. She said they were marbles. But when Mark took a closer look, he immediately called the police. Mark was relieved when the police arrived at his house, but as soon as he heard what the officer had to say, this relief turned into panic. "Sir, you need to come to the station with me. We need to ask you some questions," the officer told him, and after initially resisting, Mark realized that he had no choice but to follow the officer's orders. They put him in an interrogation room and asked him tons of questions about those marbles. It was clear that they suspected him of something, but Mark had no idea what was going on. And to make it all even worse, they decided to keep him at the station for a while. Mark desperately wanted to go home to his wife and daughter, but he was stuck. When an officer finally revealed to Mark what the marbles really were and what they suspected him of, he turned pale. He could not believe that this was really happening. He would never do such a thing. But what were these marbles really? Why did the police refuse to let Mark leave? And would he ever be able to prove his innocence? Summer was finally coming up, and Mark took every opportunity he had to spend time outside. He loved being in the fresh air and feeling the sun on his skin, and it was the perfect excuse to give the garden a little makeover, just in time for summer. He was just planting some new flowers when Sophie came running to him. "Daddy, look at this!" she yelled excitedly, and Mark stopped what he was doing to give his daughter a hug. "What did you find this time? Show me," he said, returning her excitement. Sophie had a huge smile on her face as she handed him the bag and motioned for him to look inside it. She obviously had no idea of what was about to happen. Sophie was just like her dad. She loved spending time outside, and whenever he was working outside, she was somewhere near him too, digging in the dirt or chasing bugs. And very often, she came to Mark to show him her finds. Mark loved seeing how excited it made her, and he always made sure to pay close attention to what she wanted to show him. He took the bag and carefully opened it to look inside. At first, it wasn't very clear to him what exactly he was looking at, and he glanced at Sophie with a curious look on his face, as if to ask, "What is this?" She laughed and said, "Daddy, can't you see? Look how pretty those marbles are." But her father's reaction was not what she had expected. Normally, Mark just smiled and told her that she did a great job. But this time, it was different. He took one of the marbles out of the bag to take a closer look, and he finally realized that these marbles really were. He quickly dropped it back into the bag and reached for his phone to call the police. They needed to come here immediately. "Daddy, what do you think?" Sophie asked, noticing that his excitement had suddenly disappeared. He just told her that she should not touch that bag anymore because the marbles were very dangerous, and then he focused on the phone call. "Officer, can you send someone over to our home as soon as possible? We found something." Sophie pulled his sleeve, asking, "Dad, who are you calling? Can I have the marbles back, please?" Mark kneeled beside her and looked her in the eyes when he said, "Sophie, you have to be careful. Those marbles are very dangerous and they could hurt you. Now, can you tell me where exactly you have found them?" Sophie's eyes widened upon hearing this, and she nodded, telling her dad that she understood. Then she led him to the forest that lay right next to their garden and pointed to a little bush, which was where she had found the marbles. "All right, thank you for showing me. Now, go inside the house, okay? Stay with Mommy, I'll be right there," he told her. As Sophie ran inside, Mark stayed right where he was and looked around very carefully. He kept his eyes on the ground, and he was obviously looking for something, but what? Minutes later, he gave up and followed his daughter inside, where he waited for the police to arrive. Luckily, it didn't take long, and about 10 minutes later, they knocked on the door. "Good day, officer. Please come in. Thank you for coming here so quickly." Mark greeted the man and led him inside. The man introduced himself as Officer Daniels, and he immediately asked, "Can I see them?" Mark nodded and led him into the kitchen, where he had placed the bag on the counter, out of Sophie's reach. The officer took a look inside the bag, and immediately his face hardened. Mark knew that he had done the right thing by calling the police, and he thought his job here was done. However, it wasn't going to be that simple. He expected the officer to leave and return to the station, but instead he turned to Mark and said, "Sir, you need to come with me." Mark raised an eyebrow, looking confused, and he asked, "Excuse me?" He thought that perhaps he had misheard what the officer had said, but he just repeated the same thing again. "We need to ask you some questions. Please, join me to the station. My colleagues are waiting for you there." Mark knew that he had no choice but to oblige. Mark, his heart pounding in his chest, followed Officer Daniels to the police station. The building loomed large and ominous as they approached. Inside, the stark, fluorescent-lit corridors echoed with the sound of their footsteps. Mark's mind raced with questions as he was led into an interrogation room, a small, windowless space with a single table and 2 chairs. The door shut behind him with a definitive click, leaving Mark alone in the silence. Sitting in the sterile room, Mark scanned his surroundings. The walls were bare, save for a clock that ticked loudly, marking each second with mechanical precision. Mark's thoughts turned chaotic, trying to make sense of the situation. Why was he here? What did they think he knew? The room seemed to shrink around him, the air thick with tension. He felt like a character in a crime drama, yet this was all too real. Mark's mind wandered to his cozy, lived-in home, a stark contrast to the cold, impersonal police station. At home, laughter and love filled the rooms, and warm sunlight streamed through the windows. Here, the light was harsh, the atmosphere oppressive. He longed for the familiar comfort of his family, the sound of his daughter's laughter, the gentle touch of his wife's hand. Instead, he was trapped in this alien place, disconnected from everything he held dear. As the minutes ticked by, Mark's unease grew. What were they accusing him of? He replayed the morning's events in his mind, searching for an answer. The bag of marbles, Sophie's innocent discovery, his call to the police, it all seemed so harmless, yet here he was. Doubts crept in, fear tightening its grip. He tried to stay calm, but the room felt like it was closing in on him. Mark felt like an outsider, out of place in this cold, bureaucratic world. He was a family man, a regular guy, not someone who belonged in an interrogation room. The reality of his situation was surreal. He was just a dad who had tried to protect his daughter, and now he was being treated like a criminal. The absurdity of it all was overwhelming, and Mark struggled to keep his composure. The door opened and 2 officers entered, their expressions unreadable. "Mr. Mark Henderson," one began, flipping open a notebook. "We need to discuss the marbles your daughter found." Mark, caught off guard, stuttered a response. I don't know much. My daughter found them. I thought they looked unusual, so I called you." The officers exchanged a glance, their skepticism apparent. Mark's heart sank as he realized this was just the beginning. The questions continued, each one laced with suspicion. "Where did your daughter find these marbles, Mr. Henderson? Have you ever seen them before?" Mark's confusion grew with each question. He tried to explain, to make them see his point of view, but the officers' stern expressions never wavered. Their disbelief hung heavily in the air, and Mark felt a growing sense of helplessness. This wasn't just a routine inquiry. They suspected him of something more. "I've done nothing wrong," Mark insisted, his voice firm yet tinged with desperation. "I'm just a dad, a husband. I have no idea about these marbles." His plea for understanding seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officers continued their interrogation, unrelenting. Mark's frustration mounted as he tried to convey his innocence, but the barrier of disbelief seemed insurmountable. He was telling the truth, yet it felt like a futile endeavor. No matter how much Mark explained, the officers remained unmoved. "I called you because I was concerned," Mark reiterated, his voice strained. "I thought I was doing the right thing." The officers continued to probe, asking about his activities, his family, and his past. It was as if his words were being filtered through a lens of doubt. Mark's efforts to clear his name seemed to only deepen their suspicions, turning the conversation into a one-sided interrogation. The room seemed to close in on Mark, the walls echoing with unspoken accusations. Each question felt like an indictment, and each skeptical looked a judgment. Mark's attempts to defend himself seemed to vanish into the void, leaving him feeling exposed and vulnerable. He was trapped in a narrative he didn't recognize, fighting against shadows of doubt and suspicion. The reality of his predicament was stark and chilling, and Mark felt a profound sense of isolation. As the interrogation continued, Mark felt increasingly trapped. The questions became more probing, more insistent. Where were you last Thursday evening? Do you have any ties to illegal activities? Each query felt like a tightening noose. Mark's protestations of innocence seemed to evaporate in the face of their relentless questioning. He felt cornered, his back metaphorically against the wall as the officers bore down on him with an intensity that left him reeling. Realizing that mere words weren't enough, Mark scrambled to prove his regular law-abiding life. "I can show you my work records, my community service hours," he offered, his voice edged with urgency. "Ask anyone in my neighborhood, they know me." He felt the weight of the burden of proof heavy on his shoulders, a responsibility to demonstrate his innocence against an increasingly opaque and complex backdrop of accusations. Mark began to detail his everyday life, hoping to paint a picture of normalcy. "I'm an accountant at Miller & Sons," he explained. "Weekends are for family time, barbecues with neighbors, little league games." He spoke of his daughter's school projects and his volunteering at the local food bank. Each detail was an attempt to construct a narrative of an ordinary, harmless life, far removed from any criminal undertones. Despite Mark's earnest attempts to establish his credibility, it seemed his words were not registering. The officers' expressions remained impassive, their skepticism a tangible barrier. "We appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Henderson, but we need to verify these claims," one officer said, non-committally. Mark's narrative of an ordinary life appeared to dissolve into the sterile air of the interrogation room, leaving him feeling frustrated and powerless. The gravity of his situation became increasingly apparent to Mark. Every denial, every piece of evidence he provided seemed only to deepen the officer's suspicion. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. A sense of helplessness enveloped him as he faced the grim realization that this was no mere formality. It was serious, and his life as he knew it was slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. The interrogation concluded with a heavy statement from the lead officer. "Mr. Henderson, due to the nature of this case, we need to detain you temporarily." Mark's heart sank. Despite his fervent explanations, his fate was sealed. He was escorted to a small, barren holding cell, the door closing with a definitive clank. The stark reality hit him hard. He was now a prisoner, his freedom stripped away based on suspicions and conjecture. The holding cell was a small, dimly lit room, its bare walls closing in on him. Mark sat on the hard cot, the chill of the metal seeping through his clothes. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sounds of the station. Alone with his thoughts, Mark felt a profound sense of helplessness enveloping him. This isolation was more than physical. It was a disconnection from his life, his identity, his very sense of self. In the cold solitude of the cell, Mark's thoughts turned incessantly to his family. He pictured Sophie's confused face, her innocent eyes searching for answers he couldn't provide. How would his wife explain his absence? The image of their worry, their unanswered questions, gnawed at him. He imagined them at home, feeling the emptiness of his chair at the dinner table, his side of the bed cold and unoccupied. Mark's mind was haunted by fears for Sophie. What if she blamed herself for this nightmare? The thought of his daughter carrying such a burden was unbearable. He wished he could hold her, reassure her that none of this was her fault. His role as a protector, as a father, had been compromised, leaving him tormented by a sense of failure. The safety and innocence of his child had been thrust into a world of suspicion and fear. The uncertainty of his situation weighed heavily on Mark. Questions swirled in his mind. What evidence did they have? How long would he be detained? What if they couldn't prove his innocence? The unpredictable nature of his circumstances was maddening. He felt a vulnerability he had never known, his future hanging in the balance of an investigation shrouded in mystery. In the depths of this uncertainty, despair began to set in. At home, Sophie sat in the living room, a gentle officer kneeling before her. "Can you tell me where you found these, Sophie?" he asked softly. Sophie, her eyes wide and innocent, nodded. "In the woods, near the big oak tree," she said, her voice small. She described the afternoon, the sun filtering through the leaves, the thrill of discovery. Her account was simple, untainted by the complexities that had ensnared her father. Sophie's description of the discovery site provided a vital clue. "It was just lying there, near the bushes," she continued, unaware of the significance of her words. The officer listened intently, making notes. In her innocence, Sophie offered pieces of a puzzle she didn't understand, her story painting a picture of an ordinary day turned extraordinary. Her words, candid and pure, contrasted sharply with the gravity of the investigation unfolding around her. Sophie's mother sat nearby, her face etched with worry. She interjected occasionally, her voice tinged with anxiety. She didn't know what they were, she explained, her protective instincts evident. As the questioning continued, her concern deepened. The safety of her family, once taken for granted, now felt fragile in the face of such unexpected and alarming events. Her support for Sophie was unwavering, but the strain of the situation was evident in her eyes. Through Sophie's narrative, a different perspective emerged. Her recollection was unburdened by the complexities of the adult world, a child's simple account of an afternoon adventure. The officers took note of every detail, considering how these innocent observations could fit into the larger, more ominous picture they were trying to piece together. Sophie, oblivious to the depth of the situation, provided a candid glimpse into the events that had led to her father's detention. The family's routine life was now under scrutiny, every detail examined for its potential significance. Sophie's mother answered questions about their daily activities, their interactions with neighbours, and any unusual occurrences. The normalcy of their lives stood in stark contrast to the surreal investigation that had encroached upon them. As the officers left, the family remained, enveloped in a newfound uncertainty, their home feeling less like a sanctuary and more like a stage upon which a drama was unfolding. The police team arrived at the edge of the forest near Henderson's property. They spread out, combing through the underbrush, eyes keen for any anomalies. This was where Sophie had found the mysterious marbles, the starting point of a puzzle that had grown more complex. The officers moved methodically, aware that even the smallest detail could prove critical. The quiet of the forest was punctuated only by the sound of their meticulous search. As they delved deeper, one officer called out, pointing to the ground. There, partially hidden under fallen leaves, were footprints, not those of a child's playful exploration, but of an adult's purposeful stride. Nearby, a discarded cigarette butt, an unusual brand, lay trampled. These subtle signs painted a picture of clandestine visits, suggesting that the forest held secrets not yet fully understood. The area around Mark's house was transforming from a peaceful woodland to a scene of hidden intrigue. The further they investigated, the more clues they uncovered. A piece of torn fabric caught on a bramble, a faint trail leading through the trees, barely noticeable, but to the trained eye. Each finding added to a growing tapestry of evidence. The officers realized they were dealing with more than just a random find by a child. There was a hidden narrative in these woods, a story interwoven with secrecy and perhaps danger. The forest, once a place of leisure and family walks, had transformed in the officers' eyes. Every rustling leaf seemed to whisper secrets, and the shadows cast by the trees took on a more ominous tone. The officers worked with a heightened sense of urgency, aware that they were uncovering layers of a mystery that extended far beyond a simple discovery. The forest was no longer just a backdrop to Henderson's home. It was a crucial piece of a larger puzzle. Back at the station, the gathered evidence was laid out, a mosaic of clues awaiting interpretation. Footprints, the discarded cigarette, the fabric. Each element was scrutinized, debated, and logged. The investigation team began to piece together a timeline to construct a narrative that might explain how those mysterious marbles came to rest in the forest near Mark's home. The dots were slowly connecting, leading to revelations that promised to be both surprising and unsettling. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the marbles were not mere child's playthings, but a piece in a larger, more sinister puzzle. The evidence collected hinted at activities far beyond the innocence of a child's discovery. The officers, poring over maps and reports in the station, realised they were dealing with a conspiracy that extended its roots deep into the shadows of illegality, far beyond the quiet neighbourhood of the Hendersons. The police uncovered troubling connections. Through diligent work, they traced the unique cigarette brand to a known smugglers' network, a group steeped in illegal trade. Conversations were overheard, suspicious vehicles logged near the area. The pieces began to fit together. This network, skilled in evasion and secrecy, had somehow entangled the Hendersons' lives in their web. The forest's proximity to their house had made it an unwitting cornerstone in a larger, unlawful scheme. In the dim light of the investigation room, doubts began to surface among the officers. Could Mark Henderson, a seemingly ordinary man, really be part of this? His shocked reaction, his cooperative demeanour, and his clean record painted a conflicting picture. The pieces of evidence didn't align neatly with the image of a criminal mastermind. The possibility that Mark might be an innocent caught in an unfortunate circumstance became a topic of heated discussion among the team. As new evidence came to light, the scale of justice seemed to waver. The investigators, once certain of Mark's guilt, now found themselves re-evaluating his role. Could he simply be an unsuspecting victim in a larger plot? The officers reviewed the interrogation tapes, Mark's bewildered face and earnest pleas casting a shadow of doubt on their initial assumptions. His potential involvement was scrutinized anew, weighed against the emerging narrative of a deeper, hidden criminal activity. A theory began to take shape among the investigative team. Mark's property, with its proximity to the forest, might have been used as an unwitting drop-off point by the smuggling ring. The secluded location, ideal for covert activities, could have been chosen without Mark's knowledge. This revelation shifted the focus of the investigation, suggesting that Mark and his family were accidental players in a dangerous game, their ordinary lives disrupted by the clandestine operations of others. In the midst of his uncertainty, Mark found an unexpected ally in Officer Williams, a seasoned detective with a knack for seeing beyond the surface. In the quiet of the interrogation room, Williams spoke to Mark not as a suspect, but as a human being caught in an unforeseen storm. His words shed light on the investigation's progress, offering Mark a glimpse of hope amidst his despair. For the first time since his detention, Mark felt heard and understood. As Officer Williams outlined the ongoing investigation, Mark's mind raced. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, forming a picture he couldn't have imagined. His property's unfortunate location, Sophie's innocent discovery, the hidden activities in the forest, it all made a strange sense now. Mark realised how his family had unknowingly become entangled in a web much larger and more dangerous than anything he could have envisioned. The tide began to turn when new evidence emerged. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station revealed unfamiliar faces, ones that matched descriptions of known members of the smuggling ring. These individuals had been seen loitering near the forest edge, corroborating the theory of the hidden drop-off point. This development, presented by Officer Williams, marked a significant shift in the case, casting a new light on Mark's involvement, or lack thereof. With the new leads, the investigation's focus shifted to identifying the real culprits. The police worked tirelessly, connecting the dots between the suspects and the illegal activities. Each new piece of evidence solidified the understanding that Mark and his family were mere bystanders in a dangerous game. The true perpetrators, now clearly identified, became the primary target of a reinvigorated investigation, driven by the urgency to correct a grave misunderstanding. Finally, the moment Mark had been waiting for arrived. The mounting evidence against the real criminals led to a re-evaluation of his case. Officer Williams delivered the news. "Mr. Henderson, we believe you're innocent." Mark's relief was palpable, a heavy burden lifting from his shoulders. The police, now focused on apprehending the actual offenders, began the process of clearing Mark's name, untangling him from the web of accusations that had ensnared him. The investigation led to a startling revelation. The so-called marbles that Sophie had found were in fact rare snake eggs, part of an illicit wildlife trade. This discovery shed new light on the case, revealing the true nature of the criminal activities that had inadvertently entangled Mark's family. The police, armed with this new information, recognized the global implications of the crime. The seemingly innocuous find in the forest was a critical piece of a much larger, more sinister puzzle. The moment Mark had longed for finally arrived. The doors of the station opened and he stepped out. A free man once more. His family, waiting anxiously, rushed to embrace him. Tears, laughter, and relief intermingled as they held each other tightly. The weight of fear and uncertainty that had clouded their lives was lifted, replaced by the warmth of reunion. Mark's heart swelled with gratitude and relief as he returned to the loving arms of his family. Once home, Mark took Sophie into his arms. "You did nothing wrong," he reassured her gently. He explained in words she could understand that her discovery had led to something important. Sophie, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and relief, hugged her father tightly. Mark's heart ached for the innocence she had lost, but he was determined to restore her sense of security and reassure her of the unintentional role she played. With the truth unveiled, the police acted swiftly. A raid was organized, targeting the heart of the illegal operation. The officers, armed and alert, descended upon the hideouts of the smuggling ring. The operation was intense and precise, leading to several arrests. The criminals caught off guard were unable to evade justice. The successful raid marked a significant victory against the illegal wildlife trade, disrupting a network that had operated in the shadows for too long. In the aftermath of the raid, the rescued snake eggs became a symbol of hope. The endangered species, once at risk of illegal trade, were now safe. The eggs were carefully transported to a wildlife conservation agency, where experts would ensure their survival and eventual return to their natural habitat. The agency praised the Hendersons' accidental discovery for aiding in the preservation of a precious species, turning a frightening family ordeal into a triumphant moment for conservation. Back home, the Hendersons gathered in their living room, the familiar space now a sanctuary of safety and love. They spoke softly, processing the events that had turned their world upside down. The comfort of being together, safe and unharmed, was a balm to their shaken spirits. Each shared their feelings, their fears, and their relief. In this circle of family, they found strength and solace, their bonds deepened by the ordeal they had endured. As they settled back into their daily routines, the Hendersons often reflected on the unexpected journey they had traversed. The incident had taught them about the fragility of normalcy and the strength of family unity. They discussed the importance of awareness and caution in their everyday lives, recognizing that the world was full of surprises, some less welcome than others. These lessons, learned under duress, became integral to their understanding of the world and their place in it. Gradually, life for the Hendersons began to regain its familiar rhythm. Mark returned to work, the chatter of colleagues a welcome return to normalcy. Sophie's laughter once again filled the house, her resilience shining through. The family's routine, school runs, weekend outings, evening meals together, resumed, each activity cherished as a step back to the life they knew. But this return was tinged with a newfound appreciation for the ordinary. In the wake of their experience, the Hendersons found a new joy in the mundane aspects of life. Simple pleasures, A shared meal, a walk in the park, a quiet evening at home took on a deeper significance. They revelled in the normalcy they had once taken for granted, finding happiness in the predictability and safety of their daily lives. Each mundane moment was a reminder of what they had almost lost and now regained. The story of the Hendersons' unexpected entanglement in a world beyond their imagining came to a close. They moved forward with a sense of closure and a deeper understanding of life's unpredictability. Their experience became a part of their family narrative, a tale of challenge, resilience, and eventual triumph. Life, with all its unpredictability and ordinary beauty, continued around them, each day a gift to be cherished in its simplicity and complexity.